You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Tonight, tidal waves sweep Thailand, Malaysia, India and Sri Lanka, sparked by an earthquake off Sumatra, one of the most powerful tremors in the past 100 years. The death toll, more than 4,000.
20 years ago, that breaking news spread around the world. An unfolding disaster at a time of year when the media usually doesn't have a lot of stories to report on. It was Christmas weekend. A powerful magnitude 9.1 earthquake off the west coast of Sumatra, Indonesia, unleashed a crushing tsunami. The sea swallowed whole communities. At least 225,000 people across a dozen countries died. Today, the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami is still described as one of the worst natural disasters ever recorded. Survivors in two of the worst-hit nations, Indonesia and Sri Lanka, have been rebuilding and preparing for the next colossal wave. I'm Teresa Tang. You are listening to a special episode of the CNA Correspondent podcast. My colleague Saifulbahri Ismail joins me. Hi, Saiful.
Hi, Teresa.
This disaster, it falls into the where were you when category in my mind. You know, when something so big, so unbelievable happens that time seems to stand still. So first off, take me back 20 years, Saiful. It's a long time ago, but what do you remember about the day this tsunami struck?
Wow, Teresa, 20 years ago is a long time, and my memory is definitely a little rusty, especially when you grow much older, right? The earthquake and tsunami first struck Indonesia on 26 December 2004 in the morning, I remember. I was in Singapore then. It was a Saturday, so it was my day off, and I was probably still sleeping at that time. The earthquake was very strong, but it only caused mild tremors in Singapore, and most people then were undisturbed and unaware of what had hit Indonesia. 20 years ago, there was still no social media, so the news was slow getting out of Indonesia. But I do remember watching news about the tsunami on TV later that evening. The death toll at the end of the first day was already in the thousands, and it was only days later when the world found out the actual scale of the disaster.
I've heard people talk about grief. They've described it as a living thing. It doesn't die, it doesn't go away, but it visits, it lingers. And grief is a big part of this story. Saiful, you went to Aceh in Indonesia, and you also flew to Sri Lanka, and you gauged how far survivors had come in their healing journey. What did people tell you?
That's right, Teresa. Grief is a big part of the story. I spoke with a number of tsunami survivors in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, and all of them will never forget what they went through on 26 December 2004 for the rest of their lives. Now, some of the survivors also found it difficult to recount what happened when I spoke with them. The memories are still fresh in their minds even after 20 years have passed, and trying to remember what happened that fateful day is like reliving the pain once again. Now, one of them is Leah Mailani from Aceh province in Indonesia. Leah was just 8 years old then, and it was particularly hard for her because she lost her parents that day. For a person at such a young age to lose both mother and father and become an orphan overnight must be so hard. Leah is the youngest of 6 siblings. 2 of her siblings also died during the tsunami. Leah is 28 years old now, and she told me that even though she still has her older siblings to take care of her during her growing up years, right? It was still hard to adapt to the reality of not being able to sleep with her mother anymore. I also spoke with people of different backgrounds, race and nationalities, and they all share similar stories of trepidation, trauma and anguish. Nature does not discriminate. The tsunami did not pick and choose its victims, whether they were rich or poor, black or white, men or women. They all succumbed to the wrath of the killer waves. Now, over 130,000 people were killed in Aceh province. The provincial capital, Banda Aceh, was the worst hit because it was more densely populated. More than 60,000 people died in Banda Aceh, and many more were missing. Now, what was more poignant was the fact that thousands of those killed were buried in mass graves. Now, I visited one of the mass graves in Banda Aceh where some 14,000 victims were buried there. I was told that some of the residents in Banda Aceh dreamt that their loved ones are buried in the mass graves, and they have placed tombstones there to remember them. Now, another tsunami survivor in Indonesia is Nahrawi Nordin, who managed to escape death because he was out at sea when the tsunami hit Aceh. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to find out when he got back to shore. He said it was like Armageddon in Banda Aceh. Dead bodies were lying everywhere and the strong stench of death lingered in the air. Nahrawi tried to find his loved ones, but unfortunately, there was no one left.
Pasca tsunami.
After the tsunami, I was alone. My entire family was gone. After the tsunami, I was a volunteer for 3 months. Volunteering means helping people who were hit by the tsunami, even though I was a tsunami victim. But maybe if I help these victims, maybe my body and soul will be at peace and not remember anything.
I know of stories of reporters, of journalists who went to the site after the tsunami and the quake, and they themselves were traumatized by what they saw, Saiful. So healing, it's a long process, and often faith plays a role in that process as people try to move on from a tragedy. Is that what you saw in Indonesia? Did faith play an important role?
Definitely, that's what I saw also in Aceh. Teresa, Aceh is predominantly Muslim and the province is known as Serambi Mecca or the veranda of Mecca, because this is where the spread of Islam in Indonesia began. Now, Aceh is religiously conservative and is the only province in the country that practices Sharia laws, Islamic laws, yeah? The Islamic influence is reflected in the daily lives of people there. For example, shops will close for business for a few hours on Friday afternoon for people to attend prayers at the mosques. Now, this strong affinity between the Acehnese and their religion was one of the factors that has helped Aceh get back on its feet after the 2004 tsunami. Now, I spoke with Ade Surya, who's the acting mayor of Banda Aceh, and he said that the people of Aceh are firm believers in destiny or fate, and that whatever happens is in the hands of Allah or the God Almighty. The Acehnese believe that the tsunami is their destiny, it's God's will, which must be accepted, and this acceptance of fate shaped their attitudes in dealing with the disaster. So after the tsunami, the people of Aceh did not whine or complain. That was the strength of the Acehnese. They were obedient Muslims who believed that the disaster was a test given by God. Now, one of the lessons learned from the 2004 tsunami was the lack of evacuation places near the coastline. So after the tsunami, authorities actually constructed escape buildings with the help of foreign donors, of course. Now, these 4-story buildings can accommodate more than 500 people and are strategically located about 1 kilometer from the coastline. Now, residents are urged to run to these escape buildings in the event of a tsunami. Now, in 2012, there was an 8.6 magnitude earthquake near Aceh. There was no tsunami alert, but the event caused mass panic because people were scared. With the 2004 tsunami still so fresh in their minds, right? Now, there was a study done about people's evacuation patterns. Now, interestingly, the results of the study showed that there were not many people who took refuge at the tsunami escape buildings, but there were more people who ran to horizontal buildings like mosques.
Wow.
Now, for Muslims, the mosque is a very important establishment. It is the house of God. So it was not a big surprise that residents actually trust the mosques more than the tsunami escape buildings. Now, residents had more faith in mosques because they saw how some mosques in Banda Aceh managed to survive and still stand tall during the 2004 tsunami when so many other buildings were destroyed. Now, some Acehnese also said that if there was a disaster, they would prefer to die in the mosque because they would be closer to God.
Wow, that's so interesting. Besides Indonesia, you also spent some time in Sri Lanka, and that was actually the second worst hit country after Indonesia. The tsunami led to the worst train disaster in that country's history. Can you tell us about that and how are Sri Lankans coping today?
Well, Teresa, survivors, they try to cope with the disaster in various ways, right? In Sri Lanka, I met with a survivor who witnessed the train tragedy in the small village of Paralia. Her name is Priyanthi, and she told me that the accident was so horrible that she still has difficulty dealing with it. She tries to cope by distancing herself from the tragedy itself, for example, by avoiding travel by train. Now, that particular train accident was the worst in history when some 1,700 people were killed. And when I was in Sri Lanka, I actually took a ride on a train which traveled the same route as the ill-fated one some 20 years ago. Now, personally, I love train rides. It's actually my favorite mode of transportation. And especially in Sri Lanka, where the tracks, right, they hug the coastline for many parts of the journey.
Must be a scenic journey.
Definitely, very scenic. So it's not surprising that trains are a popular mode of transportation in Sri Lanka and often packed with passengers. Now, but on 26 December 2004, the Matara Express was travelling from Colombo to Matara when the earthquake occurred some 1,700 kilometers away near Sumatra Island in Indonesia. Now, Sri Lanka's Earthquake Monitoring Office actually registered that earthquake, but they did not consider it possible for a tsunami to reach Sri Lanka. But it took about 2 hours for the giant waves to reach Sri Lanka. Now, when tsunami reports first reached Sri Lanka, authorities were able to stop 8 trains running on the coastal line, but they were unable to reach the Matara Express. Now, in Paralia, the Matara Express was forced to stop because the tracks was already inundated by water from the first tsunami wave, right? Hundreds of locals, believing the train to be secure on the rails, climbed onto the roof of the carriage to avoid being swept away. Others stood behind the train hoping it would shield them from the force of the water. By then, the waves had flooded the carriages and caused panic amongst passengers. Now, subsequently, a much bigger wave arrived, picking up the carriages like toys and smashing it against the trees and houses which lined the track, crushing people who were seeking shelter behind it.
Obviously, a lot of damage from that water, and reports say something like 80,000 homes were destroyed in the country. And in the aftermath of that, governments around the world, they offered to help Sri Lanka, not just by donating money, but they literally donated houses as well, right? There were hurdles involving those homes, though, weren't there?
One of the things which emerged from the 2004 tsunami was the pouring of aid from around the world. It was evident to see that the waves of destruction of the tsunami led to waves of compassion where people from home and abroad donated generously to help the victims. Now, a lot of the aid focused on rebuilding houses for the victims of the tsunami and people displaced. Many houses near the coastline, which were poorly constructed, were destroyed by the tsunami. So what the tsunami victims need most in the aftermath of the disaster was a place to stay and a roof over their heads. And immediately after a disaster, usually authorities and welfare organizations set up temporary shelters in evacuation centers. Now, these temporary shelters are usually in the form of tents, which are not really comfortable for people inside, right? Especially during the day when it's hot and humid. But disaster victims have little choice because permanent houses take time to be constructed. And they usually need to wait for a few years before they can move into these permanent houses. So one housing project in Sri Lanka which ran into problems was in Norocholai in Ampara district, which was one of the worst hit areas by the tsunami. Now, the project was funded by the government of Saudi Arabia to assist victims displaced by the tsunami. The complex includes 500 residential units, a school, supermarket, a hospital, a mosque, and various other amenities. So it was a real lavish housing complex. Now, that housing complex was completed in 2009, and 2 years later, the Saudi government handed the keys of the houses to the authorities for distribution among the tsunami victims. Now, I have to also point out that those residents in the Ampara district were mainly Muslims. However, the distribution was suspended on a court order which instructed the authorities to distribute the houses according to the ratio of the country's population. Of course, we know that Sri Lanka is predominantly Buddhist, right? 80% of the population are Buddhist. Now, the houses donated by the Saudi government were meant to be given mainly to help the Muslim families who were affected by the tsunami, and the remaining houses to be distributed among the other Sinhalese and Tamil community. So it's really unfortunate that this kind of political wrangling and ethnic politics have prevented many beneficiaries, like one I met, Hamida Umar, from receiving their houses.
We were hoping to get the house. The authorities are not giving us the house yet. Even after 20 years, they have not provided the house. And during those 20 years, my children suffered a lot. We are still like this today.
You also focused on the future and people preparing for what may come next. Can you talk to us about progress that there's been in developing better and maybe more advanced warning systems so people are more prepared in case another massive tsunami hits?
Yes, there definitely have been improvements in developing disaster early warning systems. 20 years ago, the lack of any warning system or proper education was evident as people were caught by surprise by the tsunami. And it was really a grim reminder that warning systems really need to be improved. After the tsunami, there were efforts to improve early warning systems such as the Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis, or DART, D-A-R-T. Now, that system consists of a tsunamimeter, which is anchored to the bottom of the seafloor, and a surface buoy. So how it works is that if a large wave passes over the tsunamimeter, it will measure a higher pressure, indicating an increase in water level. Now, the system transmits an alert to the buoy, which passes the information to a satellite and onto the relevant authorities. If a tsunami is coming, alerts then can be sent out to the public, prompting an evacuation. Now, this system, which uses the buoys, the surface buoys, right, has its limitations. For example, many of the buoys which were deployed in various parts of Indonesia are inoperable because they have been vandalized.
Oh no.
Fishermen also use them to anchor their boats. Maintenance of the buoy system is also costly. Now, this has forced the Indonesian authorities to rely on tsunami warnings from other countries' buoys in the Indian Ocean because their own has been damaged, right? And Indonesian authorities also count on manual monitoring of the sea surface. Now, the other limitation of using the buoy system is the fact that there are only so many buoys which can be placed in the ocean.
Good point.
And it's unrealistic, right, to expect the buoys to cover every spot of the ocean surface.
Yes.
For example, a buoy may be placed at location A, but the earthquake and tsunami may occur at location B. So in such cases, an early warning alert may not be able to be issued. Now, the Indonesia's National Disaster Mitigation Agency, or BNPB, said there are plans to improve the offshore tsunami early warning system. Authorities are currently assessing more dynamic and mobile system using the GPS navigation equipment on board vessels. GPS, of course, is a global positioning system. So the idea behind this system is that there will be many vessels moving across the ocean surface at any point in time, and the number of vessels will be more, definitely more than the buoys placed at these fixed locations. Now, the equipment on board these vessels will detect any changes to the water pressure, indicating a probable rise in water level, and the vessel will then send an alert if there's a potential for an incoming tsunami. But currently, most of Indonesia's disaster warning systems are terrestrial in nature, meaning that these equipment are located on land instead of the ocean. Now, there are hundreds of these earthquake sensors across Indonesia, and authorities are continuously increasing the number of these equipment because the more sensors there are on the ground, the more it will be able to quickly and accurately detect any movements in the Earth's surface.
You also learned about local wisdom on tsunamis that can help as well.
There are not many communities in Indonesia which have local wisdom on tsunamis. Now, one such community is in Simeulue Island in Aceh province. The island has beautiful beaches and is a popular destination for surfers to go there to ride the big waves, but of course not the tsunami waves. Now, in 1907, Simeulue was hit by a tsunami which killed hundreds of its residents, right? Back then, the people in Simeulue did not know what a tsunami was. They called the giant waves smong in their own local language. Now, nearly 100 years later, in 2004, Simeulue was struck by a more powerful tsunami, but miraculously, fewer than 10 people died. Now, there is an explanation for this, and this miracle didn't happen by chance. Now, residents in Simeulue have developed and cultivated their own local wisdom on tsunamis. For example, those who survived the tsunami in 1907 witnessed how water from the sea retreated for miles, exposing the beach to marine life. Now, this was a sign of danger, of an imminent threat that a tsunami is coming. Now, this knowledge has been passed down from generations since 1907 up until now. So that's how such local wisdom can be an early warning system, which has helped save lives in Simeulue, especially during the 2004 tsunami. Stories about smong, they're being told in the form of poetry, songs, and stage performances. Parents also sing lullabies about smong when they put their young children to bed. However, there are concerns that such local wisdom may one day be forgotten if there isn't any concerted effort to preserve the culture. Now, one suggestion is to formalize this kind of local wisdom into Indonesia's education system so that it can become part of the school's curriculum.
Yeah, maybe have it in textbooks or something like that. Okay, so here's where things get interesting because you journeyed about 60 kilometers from the city of Banda Aceh and you spent time in a bat cave, of all places. You were still on the job, though. This was not some sort of sightseeing side trip. And you looked at bat droppings. Saiful, what's the link between bat poo and tsunamis?
Well, Teresa, besides train journeys, I also love nature.
Okay.
And I've always been fascinated by caves, right? I've been to caves in Malaysia and, of course, Indonesia before, but never in my wildest dreams did I imagine going to a cave just to look at bat droppings. So locals call this coastal cave in Aceh Gua Eklunti, or bat droppings cave. When I was inside the cave, I was careful not to touch any of the droppings with my bare hands, and I wore a face mask. And this is because of the risk of getting infected, right, by breathing in spores of fungus often found in bat droppings. They're actually quite dangerous. Now, the mask also helped block off the strong, unpleasant and pungent odor coming from the bat's urine and droppings. The cave has a significant bat colony, and my presence together with the crew was definitely not welcomed.
Okay.
We were not only trespassing their territory, but the bats were also disturbed by our lights, right?
Oh, right. It's too bright for them.
Definitely. We brought in very strong lights. So the caves have actually existed for a very long time, and you can actually uncover a lot of secrets about the past by just exploring the cave. And true enough, in 2011, a team of geologists and archaeologists made an intriguing discovery that there were at least 11 prehistoric tsunamis that struck the coast of Aceh some 7,400 years ago. And key to this finding is the droppings of the nocturnal creatures which have inhabited the cave for thousands of years. Now, the bat droppings were used as an indicator of the presence of tsunami deposits in the cave. How is this so? Now, researchers dug the floor of the cave and analyzed the layers of sedimentation. The bat droppings, they were black in color, and they separate one tsunami episode from another. And there were 11 layers of sediments, revealing that the number of tsunamis that may have occurred in the past was actually 11, right? Now, the thickness of the sediment also indicates the strength and the duration of the tsunami. So the thicker that layer of sediment, it means that tsunami was actually very strong, because there's actually more sediments that came into the cave. Now, the entrance of the cave is also raised, so only tsunamis and severe storm surges will be able to deposit sediments into the cave. Now, understanding how often these occur is important for policy and planning for authorities. Researchers said that when these ancient tsunamis are studied, it becomes an early warning system for the future. Now, at least the local community must know that tsunami did not only happen in 2004, but it has happened before. Now, this means that it will happen again in the future.
Yeah, it's often said you have to understand the past to prepare or understand the future. So that was a very interesting part of your coverage on this topic. Another surprising dimension to this story, for me, Saiful, was the unexpected, maybe some would say fated, peace that came upon Aceh after the earthquake. Can you tell us about that?
Well, Teresa, it would be terrible to say that the 2004 tsunami was a blessing in disguise, yeah. But it probably was, because that disaster led to peace in Aceh. The province was struggling in a decades-long armed conflict with the Free Aceh Movement, or GAM, separatist group, which was seeking independence beginning in 1976. Now, rebels in Aceh had spent years fighting against the central government and left at least 15,000 people dead. And heavy military presence kept the area cut off from the outside world. Now, prospects for peace were already looking better before the tsunami, with the new government then in Jakarta, which seemed more determined to resolve the conflict, and the signs that rebels were growing wary. But the tsunami disaster provided the final push. The peace agreement was signed in Helsinki in August 2005. Now, under that deal between GAM and Jakarta, the rebels agreed to give up their demands for independence in exchange for greater autonomy in the region. Now, the GAM fighters laid down their arms, and Jakarta withdrew troops, weapons and police from Aceh and granted an amnesty to rebels and political prisoners. Now, while in Aceh, I met with Afrizal, who was a former GAM company commander. Can you imagine? Afrizal was just 23 years old, and he was already in charge of around 300 men during that conflict. Now, the ex-rebel was in the separatist camp in the mountains, And he actually saw the giant waves approaching the coast of Aceh. Now, Afrizal said the waves were like mountains that had suddenly appeared in the ocean, and saw how it swept away boats and vessels which stood in its way. Now, Afrizal knew that a major disaster was brewing, and he was very worried about what might happen to the villagers down at the mountain, right? Now, he then made the decision, and he told his men to go down from the mountain and help the villagers. Afrizal also knew about the risks of going to the villages. GAM and the Indonesian military were still fighting, and there were soldiers in the villages. But he told his men to put down their weapons because there is no use in fighting anymore. He said there were many people who needed help in the villages. So Afrizal and his men actually became among the first responders to help the victims of the tsunami. They helped prepare food for the evacuees, while at the same time, they also need to keep a low profile, right? Because of the heavy military presence in the villages. Now, Afrizal also told me one incident which I found intriguing. When he was in the village, he met with someone who was being carried on a stretcher, and this person turned out to be an Indonesian soldier who had broken his leg. Now, Afrizal actually was carrying an AK-47 rifle on his shoulder. Now, that soldier looked at Afrizal and realized that he was GAM. Afrizal told the men who were carrying the soldier to move along. So Afrizal told me that he couldn't kill that soldier because of the state that he was in, even though they were still in the midst of war, right? Afrizal said that the soldier in his condition was not his enemy, but an Indonesian brother.
Saiful, I got chills as you told that story. That's incredible. And the fact that this devastation can bring such humanity out of people.
And we thought we see it only in the movies, right?
Yeah, you described it like a scene from a movie. Wow, that's incredible. So it's been 20 years since that history-making quake and tsunami. And clearly, Indonesia and Sri Lanka have learned lessons from it. But I wonder, what about the rest of us? How much of a wake-up call was it for other countries around the world?
Well, Teresa, there are definitely many lessons learned, right, from the 2004 tsunami, not only for countries hit by the disaster, but also for populations not affected by it. There was, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, extensive news coverage immediately after the disaster, but the topic was still being discussed many years afterward. And I mean, we are still here talking about the tsunami, even though nearly 20 years have passed, right? Now, all this has helped create greater awareness. Now, people in countries not affected by the tsunami actually now better understand about things like the retreating seawater phenomenon. And they will be more mindful if ever they get to witness such an event, wherever they may be. People may be living in the safest places on Earth that is free from natural disasters, but people are also mobile. They travel all the time.
That's a good point.
And they may be on a beach holiday in Indonesia one day.
Yeah.
And if they see such retreating water phenomenon, they may well remember not to be too curious and step onto the beach, but to quickly evacuate themselves to a safer place, knowing that a disaster may be approaching. So, in this respect, the lessons learned are not only for communities affected by the disaster, but really it's for everyone. Now, after the 2004 tsunami, there also have been changes and improvements in technology and methods, and this will continue to be developed. Better early warning capabilities and the public's greater understanding of tsunamis, dangers, and tsunami danger preparedness and response efforts, they may not be able to prevent nature taking its course, right? But they could surely minimize the destruction to properties and, most importantly of all, minimize the loss of human lives.
Still, so hard to believe it was 20 years ago, Saiful. Thank you so much for this heartbreaking but also very inspiring conversation. Thanks for this.
It was a pleasure being here.
And you can watch Saiful's report on YouTube and also on CNA.Asia. Don't forget, there are also TV episodes of CNA Correspondent every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and myself, Teresa Tang. Thanks very much for joining us.